Let's finally get into Blast, the subject matter of the episode. All of that, I think, was 5 or 6 or 7 different ways to enter into the Blast conversation, and now we're finally here. But really, starting at the very, very beginnings, where did the idea for Blast come from in the first place? Because you already had Blur. Blur is already a project that like you could spend your whole entire life building that whole kingdom. But Blast is also an entirely brand new, very ambitious project. Where did the idea for Blast come from? Why does the world need Blast? Why do you need to build Blast?
With Blast, the intention was never to start up another project. That was like one contributing to one is enough effort. Doing two simultaneously is like extremely exhausting. But Blast came about for a number of reasons. One of them was actually informed by my experience contributing to Blur. So at a certain point, we started looking at layer twos, right? Like I think layer twos in general is like pretty obvious. They're the future. Someone having to spend like $50 in gas on an NFT on L1, that just really prices out a ton of use cases and possibilities of what, NFTs, which is like, non-fungible digital assets, can be. So we were really digging into the various L2s. I was fortunate to be able to talk with pretty much like every team, like the founders of the various L2s, had my co-founder digging into them as well from a technical perspective. And the thing that really stood out to me after doing that investigation was and this is from the perspective of a builder, right? Because there's different perspectives that you have to consider here. But from the perspective of a builder, behind one of the largest L1 apps, right? If you go to and look at like the gas consumers, Blur is consistently one of the top ones. So from the perspective of a builder from one of those dApps, I didn't find any L2 particularly compelling. They seemed to all offer pretty much the same thing. And it was really confusing to me because I was like, okay, actually when my perception of L2s as a bystander, right? This is like as an outsider, again, and the outsider perspective is usually the perspective that you can kind of discount the most. You should at least just like weight it the least. But as an outsider, initially, I was like, oh, these L2s are like super differentiated. Like, this one has this feature and this one has this feature, and they all talk about different things, and they're all kind of have their stake in different aspects of the market. So that was like my perspective. And then once I actually dug into it, I was like, wait, actually, like as a builder, I don't really find any of these like particularly compelling. That was one. Another one was, on the Blur side, a problem that we experienced was that the Blur pool had around like $100 million in it, since like February, basically of 2023. And that ETH was just sitting there, not earning any yield. And we realized early on, we're like, wait, this is like a ton of ETH in the pool. If yields could be earned from this, it could be really utilized in a helpful way, right? It could fund further contributions. It could go back to the users. Like those would be great things. But when we dug into it from a technical perspective, it was not really feasible to go ahead and take advantage of the yield just due to the transactions and the gas and just like the mechanics of like what needed to be done. So we had this, pool with like a ton of ETH, and there's value that could have been unlocked from it. And we're never able to tap into it. And then basically, those were kind of like two underlying principles. Blast came about from identifying, after digging into the L2 market, realizing that, there was this large gap that wasn't filled and that none of these L2s were offering yield to the users. And, when you think about yield, it's a really important concept because ultimately, there's two high-level principles that you kind of hold to be true. One is that markets will march towards efficiency, and two is that liquidity will flow to where it can get the highest yield. And if you think about the different types of yield, there's a lot of history that you can study. One example of yield, of course, is the quote-unquote risk-free rate that the Fed controls, right? And this raising this or lowering this by even like a few bips actually has like drastic impacts on the economy, and it's how they actually control and influence inflation. And just with a few percentage points, they're able to actually like drastically have significant impacts on the economy. And if you look on chain, there now exists on Ethereum a similar low risk yield in the form of ETH staking. And so Ethereum as an L1 had this yield, right? It's like around 3 to 4%. And that alone sucked up around, like $20 billion of liquidity into the various like liquid staking protocols. Now it's probably more, haven't checked recently. But That was the case on the L1s, but on the L2s, all of them had a baseline interest rate of about 0%. And when I realized that, that really stood out to me. I was like, wait, like the interest rate is 0% on L2s when it's actually, around 3 to 4% on L1s. And so the realization was that we could actually basically have a 0 to 1 moment. We could raise the interest rate from 0% to around 3 to 4% by implementing native yield into the L2. There's a big question initially on whether that was even possible. We had to make really significant changes, as well as just like coming up with like fairly novel mechanisms to actually make that native yield possible. That was like step one. But once we identified that that was possible, we were like, okay, this is clearly the future. This actually enables a lot of really interesting things. One is obviously for the users. Now they're just earning more by default. So like Blast users as a whole are earning around 130 million in annual yield just by keeping their ETH and stables on Blast. But actually, from a developer's perspective, it actually enables you to build new kinds of dApps and specifically new business models that aren't really possible anywhere else. And once we realized this, we were like, okay, this is clearly going to be, like where the future lies. And that's where we, threw the energy into. So it wasn't like a premeditated thing. We didn't like plan on going out and, my co-founder and I, we didn't plan on starting up an L2. We weren't like, oh, the L2 market is like a big market and we want to get into it. That was not at all the intention. Really, it was us as users, as builders, in this case, looking at L2s, basically realizing that none of them were particularly interesting for us as builders. And then from there realizing, oh, like what, this is the shape of something that actually would be really interesting and valuable to us.
If you enjoyed all of that, then you'll absolutely love the Bankless newsletter. Join over 300,000 fellow readers, all for free. Click below to sign up.